Okay, so before I even get into this story, I need you to do me a favor. I need you to sit down, grab whatever you're drinking right now, and just get comfortable. Because what I'm about to tell you is one of those stories that starts off sounding like your average family group chat argument and ends with people saying things that cannot be unsaid, decisions being made that cannot be undone, and an entire family tree essentially catching fire from the roots up. And the wildest part? Every single thing I'm about to tell you actually happened. This isn't a movie. This isn't a drama series. This is just family. And sometimes, family is the most unhinged thing in the world. So let's set the scene. We're talking about a family. Let's call them the Harmon family because I always love a good name. And on the surface, they look like what most people would describe as a lot. There's a big extended family, multiple siblings, cousins, in-laws, the whole thing. Sunday dinners, group chats, shared memories, the kind of family that seems loud but loving from the outside. The kind where you think, oh wow, they must have so much fun together. But here's the thing about families that seem loud and loving from the outside. Sometimes the volume isn't joy. Sometimes it's just years and years of unresolved tension masquerading as normal. And this particular story starts, as so many family disasters do, with an inheritance. Now, the grandmother of this family, let's call her Grandma Ruth, had been sick for a while. Not suddenly, not shockingly. Everyone knew it was coming. She was in her late 80s. She'd lived a full life, and over the course of about 2 years, her health had been gradually declining. During that time, she had been living with her daughter, the oldest of her 3 children. Her name was Diane. Diane had basically put her entire life on hold to take care of her mother. She quit her part-time job. She rearranged her house. She handled the medical appointments, the medications, the nights when Grandma Ruth couldn't sleep and just needed someone to sit with her. Diane did all of it, quietly, without complaint, because that's just who Diane was. Her 2 siblings, a brother named Marcus and a younger sister named Carla, were around. They visited. They called. They brought flowers and casseroles and said things like, "Let us know if you need anything." But Diane never asked, and they never pushed, and for 2 years that arrangement just held until Grandma Ruth passed away, and that's when everything started to unravel. See, Grandma Ruth had a will. She'd had it for years, and the contents of that will were known, or at least everyone thought they were known. The family home, which was paid off and worth a decent amount, was to be split 3 ways between Diane, Marcus, and Carla. Her savings were to be divided equally. There was some jewelry, some sentimental items, a car. All of it had been sort of loosely discussed over the years in the way that families talk about these things. Casually, uncomfortably, never really directly. But what nobody knew, and I mean nobody, was that Grandma Ruth had updated her will about 6 months before she died. And in the updated version, she left the house entirely to Diane. Not split 3 ways, just Diane, along with a letter explaining her reasoning. That Diane had sacrificed years of her life, her time, her energy, and her own well-being to care for her, and that this was her way of making sure that sacrifice was acknowledged and compensated. It was a thoughtful decision. A loving decision. And you would think, right, that a family who watched Diane do all of that work for 2 years would understand. You would think they might feel some guilt, actually. Some relief that their sister was being recognized. You would be wrong. Marcus found out first because he arrived early to the attorney's office for the reading of the will. And by the time Carla arrived and they all sat down together, the tension in that room was already at about a 7 out of 10. By the time the attorney finished reading, it was an 11. Marcus didn't yell. Not right there, not in the office. He was too proud for that. He just went very, very quiet in that way that actually feels worse than yelling. He thanked the attorney, stood up, nodded at Diane, didn't hug her, didn't speak to her, and walked out. Carla, on the other hand, did not hold it together. She started crying immediately and saying things like, "Mom wouldn't have done this on her own. Someone must have influenced her," which, and I want you to really absorb this, is the most painful thing you can say to someone who spent 2 years caring for a dying parent. The implication being that Diane had somehow manipulated their sick, elderly mother into changing the will in her favor. Diane, to her enormous credit, did not respond. She just sat there and let her sister say what she needed to say. And then she gathered her things and went home. And that should have been the end of it. That should have been the moment where everyone went home, cried a little, processed their feelings, maybe talked to a therapist, and eventually came back together as a family that understood, even if they were hurting. But this is a revenge story channel. So you already know that's not what happened. The group chat became a war zone within 48 hours. Marcus sent a long message, very measured, very legal sounding, talking about his belief that the will had been unduly influenced, and that he intended to explore his options. Carla followed it up with something far less measured, essentially accusing Diane directly of manipulating their mother, saying that she'd always known Diane had a way of making herself the favorite, which again, the woman literally gave up 2 years of her life. But go off, Carla. Diane responded once. Just once. She sent a single message that said, "I loved Mom. I cared for her because I loved her, not because I expected anything. If you want to contest the will, that is your right. But I will not be responding to accusations in a group chat." And then she left the group. Now here's where it really starts to escalate, because a few days later, word gets around to the extended family. Cousins, aunts, Grandma Ruth's surviving sister, who is in her 90s and very opinionated, everyone starts weighing in, and families, as you know, don't just divide down the middle when something like this happens. They fracture into like 17 different factions. You've got the people who side with Marcus and Carla because they feel bad for them. You've got the people who side with Diane because they watched her take care of Ruth and know the truth. You've got the people who claim to be neutral, but are absolutely stirring the pot privately. And then you've got the people who are just using the chaos as an opportunity to bring up every other grievance they've ever had with anyone in this family since 1987. The Sunday dinners stopped. The casual phone calls stopped. Diane, who had just lost her mother after 2 years of intensive caregiving and was probably running on empty emotionally, was now also dealing with family members calling her selfish, calling her manipulative, in one extremely wild instance, having a cousin show up at her front door to talk some sense into her, as if she had done something wrong, as if she was the villain of this story. And here's where the revenge part kicks in, because Diane, quiet, patient, selfless Diane, had been keeping records. See, when you're a caregiver, especially a full-time one, you end up documenting a lot. Doctor's appointments, medication schedules, care notes. Diane had kept a detailed log of everything she had done for her mother over 2 years. Not because she was planning to use it, but because that's just what good caregiving requires. She had receipts for medications she'd paid for out of pocket when insurance was slow. She had records of the nights she'd stayed awake. She had text messages from Marcus and Carla where they'd declined to come help, or said they were too busy, or promised to take over for a weekend and then canceled. She didn't share any of this publicly. She didn't blast it in the family group chat. But when Marcus's attorney sent a formal letter indicating they were pursuing a claim of undue influence against the will, Diane got herself a very good attorney of her own, and she handed over every single piece of documentation she had. The undue influence claim requires proving that the person who made the will was somehow manipulated or coerced. And in order to make that argument, Marcus and Carla would essentially need to demonstrate that their mother wasn't in her right mind, or that Diane had some kind of controlling influence over her. But here's the thing about Grandma Ruth. She had been assessed by multiple medical professionals in the months before she passed, and every single one of them had noted that she was mentally sharp, that she made her own decisions, and that she was entirely competent. She had actually discussed her intentions with her attorney directly, without Diane present, specifically to ensure there was no question about the independence of her decision. The attorney had documented all of it. So not only was the undue influence claim extremely weak from a legal standpoint, but in building their case, Marcus and Carla's attorney started pulling on threads that did not look good for them. Like the text messages, where they'd said they couldn't come help. Like the records showing they had not contributed financially to their mother's care in any documented way. Like the fact that Diane had documentation going back months of Ruth expressing, in writing, her wishes and her reasoning. The legal challenge collapsed, and it collapsed publicly enough that the family members who had been loudest in their support of Marcus and Carla went very, very quiet. But the story doesn't end there. Because around this time, something else happened that nobody saw coming. Carla, in her grief and her rage, had been posting things on social media. Vague things, the kind of posts people write when they want sympathy without being direct. Some people show their true colors when money is involved. Blood doesn't always mean loyalty. That kind of thing. And her followers, mostly mutual friends and extended family, had been commenting with support and encouragement, naturally assuming Carla was the wronged party, because Carla was the only one telling any part of the story publicly. Diane saw these posts. She didn't respond. She didn't comment. She didn't subtly reply or send private messages to people setting the record straight. She just documented them, saved them, and when her attorney mentioned that the social media posts could potentially constitute defamation, given the implication that Diane had acted dishonestly, Diane authorized a cease and desist letter to be sent to Carla. Now, I want to pause here and just appreciate the composure it takes to handle something like this the way Diane did, because she was grieving. She had just lost her mother. She was being accused of manipulation by the very siblings who had not been there. And instead of exploding, instead of sending the 47-paragraph text message that I absolutely would have sent, she just quietly, calmly, and methodically made sure she was protected at every turn. She didn't fight dirty. She didn't fight loudly. She just fought smart. The cease and desist hit Carla like a bucket of cold water. Suddenly, this wasn't just a family argument. Suddenly, there were attorneys involved, legal consequences being discussed, and Carla's husband, who had apparently been trying to be the voice of reason this entire time, bless this man, basically sat her down and told her this needed to stop. Carla deleted the posts. She didn't apologize, not at first, but she deleted the posts. Marcus, for his part, had gone very silent after the legal challenge fell apart. The way that people go silent when they realize they've overplayed their hand and they're not sure how to come back from it. He'd spent money on an attorney. He'd rallied family members to his side. He'd made public accusations, not on social media, but in enough phone calls and family conversations that plenty of people had heard his version of events, and none of it had worked. His mother's will stood. His sister had the house. Months passed. The holidays came and went, and for the first time in decades, there was no big family gathering. No Sunday dinners. No group photo. Just separate lives being lived separately, with an enormous amount of unspoken grief sitting underneath all of it. And then, nearly a year after Grandma Ruth passed, something shifted. Ruth's surviving sister, the 90-something aunt I mentioned earlier, the opinionated one, reached out to Diane directly. This woman had known Diane since she was born. She had watched everything unfold, and she called her up and said something along the lines of, "Your mother told me what she was doing and why she was doing it, and she told me she hoped your brother and sister would understand one day. She didn't want this to tear you all apart. She just wanted to make sure you were taken care of." And Diane, who had been strong through all of it, cried. She cried a lot. Because sometimes the vindication doesn't feel the way you thought it would. Sometimes being right doesn't actually make any of it feel better, because at the end of the day, you still lost your mother, and then you lost your siblings too, at least for a while. And that's a lot of loss to carry. The aunt, bless her heart, and her 90-something years of earned wisdom, didn't stop there. She reached out to Marcus and Carla too, not to lecture them, not to tell them they were wrong, though they absolutely were, but just to share what their mother had told her, to give them some context, to let them sit with the truth in a way that didn't feel like an attack. Carla broke first. She called Diane about 2 weeks later, and it was awkward, and it was emotional, and it wasn't a perfect apology, but it was an apology. She said she'd been so consumed by grief and what felt like being overlooked that she'd turned it into something ugly, and she was sorry for the accusations, and she was sorry for the social media posts, and she was sorry for making an already painful time even more painful. Diane accepted it, not naively. She wasn't under any illusion that things would snap back to what they were before, but she accepted it because she's that kind of person. Because she understood that grief makes people irrational. Because Carla was still her sister. Marcus took longer. Marcus, I think, had a harder time with it because he had been so certain. He'd built such a firm conviction in his own mind that Diane had done something wrong, that walking that back required dismantling a story he'd been telling himself for a year. He eventually reached out too. His conversation with Diane was shorter, more practical, less emotional. But he reached out, and that was something. The family hasn't snapped back to what it was. Some of those extended family relationships are still strained. Some things that were said during that year are still sitting in people's memories, a little tender. There's no big Sunday dinner yet. But there have been smaller things. A birthday gathering here, a phone call there. The careful, tentative process of rebuilding something that was cracked almost all the way through. And what I keep coming back to, thinking about this whole story, is Diane. Because the revenge in this story isn't flashy. Nobody got dramatically called out. Nobody was publicly humiliated. Nobody's life was blown up in a spectacular way. The revenge was just Diane winning, quietly and completely, by being exactly who she already was, by documenting, by staying composed, by letting the truth do the work instead of doing it herself. She never matched the energy of the accusations. She never descended to the level of the group chat warfare. She just held her ground, protected herself, and waited. And the people who came for her ended up having to face the truth of who they were in those 2 years when their mother was sick and their sister was handling everything alone. That's not something Diane did to them. That's something they did to themselves. She just didn't let them rewrite it. There's something really powerful in that, because I think a lot of us in that situation would have fought back loudly, would have sent the long text, would have posted our own receipts publicly, would have told anyone who would listen exactly what Marcus and Carla had and hadn't done while their mother was dying. And honestly, that impulse is understandable. That impulse is human. But Diane somehow knew that the loudest response wasn't the most effective one. She knew that her documentation, her attorney, and the truth were enough. She didn't need to perform her pain for an audience to validate it. Grandma Ruth, who by all accounts was a sharp and loving woman right up until the end, knew what she was doing when she wrote that letter explaining her decision. She wasn't just leaving her daughter a house. She was leaving her a record. A permanent, legal, written record that said, "I saw what you did. I knew what it cost you. And I want the world to know that it mattered. That's not something anyone can contest in a courtroom. And it's not something anyone can take away." So if you're watching this and you're in the middle of your own family drama and it feels like it's escalating faster than you can keep up with, let Diane be your blueprint. Document everything. Stay calm when everyone around you is losing it. Let the people who are acting out of grief or greed reveal themselves without your help. And trust that the truth, even when it's slow, eventually does what it's supposed to do. Because family drama that escalates way too fast almost always burns itself out eventually. The question is just whether you're still standing when the smoke clears. And Diane was absolutely still standing. All right, loves, that is the story for today, and I really hope you felt every single moment of that one, because I certainly did while writing it. If you are new here, welcome. This channel is your home for the most unhinged, satisfying, and sometimes heartbreaking real-life stories I can find. And I promise you, there is so much more where this came from. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a single one. Drop a comment telling me whose side you were on at the beginning versus the end, because I know some of you started out maybe feeling a little conflicted, and then the documentation came out and everything shifted. I see you, and I will see all of you in the next one.